Well, good morning, good afternoon, good day. Welcome to you all. It's a great joy for us to join together in this conference. Of course, these days, just about everything is virtual. This e-conference on degrowth, living sufficiently and sustainably, sponsored and executed by the NIFEA initiative of these 5 ecumenical organizations, the CWM, the LWF, the WCRC, the WCC, and the WMC. It's a great pleasure that you have come to join us for these important discussions, and we look forward to your sharing that this could be a very interactive experience in which all of us will be able to be benefiting for the improvement towards a better world. Will you then, in a moment of prayer, join us as we speak to the God of life? Let us pray. Holy God, you who are the giver of life, and you who provide our world, its environment, and sustain it, we praise and give you thanks for who you are. We are your people of faith, and it is you who have called us into faith, and we believe in you that all things are possible. And yet, when our nerves fail, and when we recoil from life's crucial tests, we come humbly to you, and we pray, gracious God, that at such fearful times, you, by the power of your Spirit, would encourage us to persist in faith, that we may live to see your glory. When our integrity is broken and our self-esteem challenged, life beats us down, we feel the power that can destroy, and we feel we are nothing. Help us, we pray, to hear ourselves crying to you, Father, Mother, God, you who love us, fill us, we pray, with your sanity, and give us a new beginning in this life, we pray, and give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, the NIFEA initiative is that which serves to envision a new international financial and economic architecture for the global economy. And we hope through this forum to define and unpack various visions of a degrowth or post-growth world. So here we are, sharing various points of view on the implications of these visions for the urgent global ecological crisis into which this, our single planetary home, has been plunged. The implications for the current public health crisis, the COVID pandemic, cannot be ignored. We know that all human activity affects the major climate systems. We know that as a world, we must do more and we must do better. These issues matter to people of faith. And as faith-based communities, we are motivated to help each other, to find models of sharing the good life to meet the needs of all people while nurturing the creation gifted to us by God. By the end of this conversation and the conversations that have gone before, we anticipate the draft of a short ecumenical message directed at the G20 Leaders Summit scheduled for Rome at the end of this month. So we encourage you, as you contribute to our discussions, as you participate, know that together in our each small way, we are seeking to do something for the good of God's great world. It is my great pleasure then to present these speakers to us as we listen to them. They come from the global north and south. They represent indigenous people. We will hear the Pacific perspective and the perspective of theologians and economists. It will be a rich sharing in which I believe we're all going to be the beneficiaries. Help me then, firstly, to welcome Dr. Priya Luka. She's in the UK, formerly of Christian Aid. She now lectures in economics at Goldsmith University in the UK. And it's a great pleasure to have her. Let's listen together and share with her.
Thanks so much to NIFEA and all the organisers, and Gordon, thank you for the introduction. So thinking about degrowth and post-growth, what does that mean, and how do we kind of think about what practical action we can take to kind of fight what big institutions and structures are set up as the global economy? So I think for me, when we think about degrowth and post-growth, it usually kind of looks like a debate on consumer profiles, consumer preferences, curtailing consumer spending and consumption, and kind of geared around kind of the idea of kind of having a responsibility around consuming less, which of course is kind of, you know, important and kind of the building stone of kind of what would be a much more sensible way of treating all of the allocation of resources that we have on the planet, which are finite. But for me, there's also a really missing dynamic when we think about, you know, targeting a degrowth discussion around consumerism, which is about, it's actually also missing the kind of dynamic that this is about the difficult politics of redistribution. And, you know, kind of saying to consumers, you know, you should be buying less, you should be, you know, allowing for future generations to enjoy the resources that we have as a planet. You should be, you know, thinking more about kind of a much more measured approach to consumption, misses the fact that actually we have huge and excessive and extractive elite consumption on a level that's not even measured or quantified in the world. And that's why I say that degrowth is about the politics of redistribution. Because if we think about kind of tax law, tax systems, we think about commodity extraction, and we think about the incentives provided at the moment by the multilateral institutions for development projects. All of those are allowing and enabling a thriving kind of resources extraction of the planet. They're also allowing, you know, massive profit exploitation and gain for elite producers and kind of elite company owners. And that's kind of missing the dynamic that if we're thinking about degrowth, this applies to everyone, to every person. Everyone has a kind of role in the economy. Everyone has a participation in the economy. And I think that to say that it only comes to a microeconomic kind of perception of kind of consuming less is a very narrow interpretation of it. So we think about, first of all, going back to kind of development assistance and aid and what we've been led to think works. What we have is a structural dependency that from the colonial era, and we've been told that in that situation, aid disbursements and loans, along with economic growth, will reduce inequality and provide opportunities for the majority of people all over the world. And although like we have actually seen so many countries gain political independence from colonialism, we still see this enduring effect of discrimination, inequality and poverty. And actually now a kind of, you know, public health and public land has also been captured. And we see kind of a neo-coloniality where we've seen, like with COVID, as Gordon mentioned, the private healthcare and medicine in countries is the only option in so many settings. And this has really visibilized and exposed health inequities. So this is all really important because we've been indoctrinated in this idea that economic growth will reduce poverty. But in fact, to get the growth to the level that would be needed to kind of produce the kind of revenue that would build healthcare systems, build public education to a level that would be deemed satisfactory and deemed to what level we are used to in so many settings in what are the more northern countries of the world, is an impossible ask. And I think to grow growth to that level is also a fallacy that can happen. Economic growth would need to be, several times what it is to meet the kind of goals of the SDGs itself, to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So these levels of growth that are promised as kind of, providing a fixed poverty, ending poverty, themselves are unattainable. But yet what we see in the world is the wealth of the kind of 8 white men who control most of the world's wealth is not dismantled, and regulators cannot tax them proportionate to their gains. So again, where is the degrowth there? Where is the considered and responsible consumption there? Extractive industries thrive because politicians are complicit and also don't want to really end poverty. When we see this kind of fallacy of free trade, liberalization, free capital flows, and the catch-up development idea, in reality, what this looks like is loans, infrastructure projects, public and private partnerships, and trade agreements that don't really lead to any kind of clear mutual gain or transformation, but actually today are creating more debt and more dependency and more modalities of enforcement, economic disciplining, monitoring and surveillance by elite institutions. And in that whole context, we see this kind of continued idea of labor as commodity and something that can be separated from self and exchange on a market. So where, for me as an economist, like where I feel the hope and the positivity comes is in looking at kind of decolonial ideas and looking at kind of reparations and the idea of repair and what that means for the degrowth agenda. So I think that, first of all, that means repairing from this political othering and moving to narratives of global solidarity to find connections between our movements, which have always actually been in deep spiritual relationship with each other, from examples in history, for example, the American Indian movement and the Black Panther movement, or now the movement of Indian farmers and the agroecology movements in Latin America. Why is it important that we kind of bring together this global solidarity when we think about degrowth and consumption? That's because it's really important to expose market-driven development that's embedded in structural adjustment policies. And what I would say that, when my economics kind of practice kind of takes me is in reimagining progression, policy invention, and even revolution via these decolonial and particularly anti-racist, anti-oppression community voices. So the fight for degrowth really, for me, comes in advancing non-Western knowledge systems and their production. And that's really, really important in terms of like indigenous knowledge and the embodiment of this nature harmony kind of approach that's been long there in history, but is ignored in a lot of our policy discourse. And by that would also lead to dismantling social hierarchies that are constructed by colonialism. But importantly, it would also give us the prompt to de-link from Western concepts and measurements like GDP and redefine progress from the perspectives of grassroots communities. So I'd end by saying that really, if we think about the movements and the inspiration that we have from history and current movements today, from Black liberation to caste justice, Dalit liberation movements, to land redistribution campaigners across the world, the creation of radical futures is already happening. And we need to think about the potential and the politics of healing from historical and ancestral trauma and reference the work of repair and reparations movements, which are creating and unleashing energy across the world, which I think makes many mainstream policymakers and economists very uncomfortable. And I think within this context, for me as an economist, it's important to continue to think about rebuilding connection and interdependency and recreating this sacred spiritual domain in creating visions and possibilities for what our world can look like. And this can be through invoking indigenous and non-Western knowledge systems that are very, very different to kind of the conceptualization that we have around self and self-consumption. How does this relate to kind of where we are and about 5 weeks away from the IPCC critical talks? I think the idea of this new Green Deal is really important in that context, but we need to make sure as campaigners and activists that it doesn't become new green imperialism, and actually this idea of elite accumulation and a kind of very fractional approach to the income of global majority people increasing. So at the one hand, you have like excessive profits, and that kind of consumption is fine and just seen as kind of, you know, the way that the world will continue to grow, and that you see like very little growth, if not income depression for most people, global majority people across the world, fighting to come out of the pandemic. So that's why I say that the process ahead is complex. It's not without a lot of challenges. There are more people in power sitting behind all of these donors and elite institutions and the multilateral framework that have more power to lose than the, you know, mass kind of reawakening for people who really need that power. So to kind of start that journey is kind of complex, involves lots of movements coming together, involves all of our conversations and widening them and shouting them as loudly as possible, and really tackling kind of, you know, the kind of difficult politics of redistribution, which I think is essentially part of the degrowth journey ahead. So thank you.
Gordon, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Priya. You certainly have given us a sense of the magnitude of this challenge, and you have helped already to define what the kind of new approaches, different approaches, anti-elitist approaches, which run contrary to much of the ways in which the world economy has been designed over the last 500 to 600 years. Many thanks to you, and that economic perspective certainly sets the basis for us to have a rich conversation. No doubt there'll be many persons asking you questions and discussing those issues with you. When we come to the question and answer portion, we might invite folk to put in your questions in the chat as we go along, so that we don't ignore the areas that you are most interested in. At this point now, we welcome Reverend Shibong Kernel. He's in the US, and he's Executive Director of Native American Comprehensive Plan of the United Methodist Church in the USA, and also a member of the WCC's Ecumenical Indigenous Peoples Reference Group. He comes to us and brings a perspective from Indigenous people. Warmest welcome.
Thank you, Gordon. It is my pleasure to be here early this morning in Central United States. I'm thankful to have this opportunity, just so that our relatives on our meeting here understand that not only do I affiliate with this United Methodist denomination, but I'm also a traditional practitioner of our indigenous peoples and practice our ceremonial ways and understanding of how we're to live in this with this Mother Earth and in our world today. So I have prepared a statement in response to the request for our topic today, and so I will be reading that for translation purposes. So if you'll just bear with me, I will present my comments on our discussion, but I want to express my appreciation to each one of you for allowing our indigenous peoples from throughout the world this opportunity to express our concern with not only these reports that have been listed, but also the continued frustration of our advocacy for this Earth Mother and everything that we do to protect her and all of its inhabitants, which include the human race as well. But I will read this statement. I want to say a warm greetings to each of my relatives from across this world. Today, I join the chorus of Indigenous voices from every region, decrying the devastation that is taking place to our Mother Earth. For decades now, Indigenous tribes have attempted in good faith to work with government and secular entities in describing the consequences of the constant displacement and dispossession of Indigenous tribes from ancestral territories and domains, and the constant acceptance of the presence of extractive industries in these territories. Time has proven the devastating impact that these industries have had on the ecosystems and the biodiversity that exists. The territories and homelands that indigenous peoples have lived on at one time existed in harmony as the natural world, with all inhabitants living in a reciprocal manner of existence. This included human beings. Humans have done more damage to Mother Earth in the past 200 years than the previous 2,000 years. One basic characteristic that has existed in indigenous cultures worldwide is the concept of reciprocity, the concept of not taking more than one needs. We realize that with every one piece of food we harvested it from the plant world or the animal world is a life and possesses an energy that is found in the earth, an energy that is also found in human life. This energy must be respected and not exploited. When life was taken or crops were harvested, oftentimes it was done under a religious or ceremonial ritual. A ritual of leaving an offering of portions of the harvest were often given back to the earth, or perhaps those who hunted, fasted, and denied themselves in honor of the life that was being taken to nourish the entire community. Respect was shown to that life. Today, for food, we massively destroy livestock. We allow excess amounts of life to be taken. We allow corporate entities to overharvest life from the sea, jeopardizing life in the water, all to sell on the market. We have lost our reverence and respect for all of creation. We have lost our sense of reciprocity, as it is this earth mother that sustains us, that nourishes us, and we are to live in respect of that earth mother. Indigenous peoples across the world still live with this respect. We have done so in a sustainable way for thousands upon thousands of years without jeopardizing the planet and its inhabitants. Today, as we listen to voices from our communities of indigenous peoples, and as we listen to the voices of faith, we must now begin to adhere to the massive amounts of voices sounding the massive alarm to stop consuming all that the earth provides. With climate change now causing loss of life and land, our hope is it is not too late. In the central portion of the United States, I myself have already witnessed cyclones, or tornadoes as we call them here, that have been the biggest ever seen on record, all triggered from warming seawaters that fuel to energy of our area. I have already witnessed traditional ceremonies be disrupted as the community went to water, as our ceremonial ritual, as we went to go and wash up and to take a drink into our mouth of water, to end our time of fasting, only to see, once we arrived at our respective creeks and rivers, to see that extractive industries from oil and petroleum companies have dumped their waste into these streams. It is time we realize the clean air, water, and land are human rights and not modes of economic developments. Those persons in so-called developed nations who contribute the most to global emissions must end the constant consumption of food, energy, and land. In these so-called developed nations, it must be realized that the amount of food that is being consumed and or wasted, and the amount of energy that it takes to mass produce either crops or livestock, contributes to this consumption mentality. Communities across the world survive and thrive with only a fraction of the amount of calories consumed in so-called developed countries. One simple solution that was expressed by some of our indigenous farmers in northern Japan recently was something as simple as, we eat what we grow. This simple notion, if understood, would help us in the harm that is happening today. The concept of wealth and progress must be redefined from indigenous perspectives and from more holistic perspectives, as we must realize that if we do not stop our consumption of all that is on the earth, life will not exist, and the only thing that will be left will be stacks of physical money and weapons that we fail to use in our fight for control. Each of which we use today to guide our understanding of what is wealth. Wealth and progress should not be defined by expansive luxuries that are found in so-called developed nations, but rather how we live in harmony with all of life and all of creation, from the smallest of the animal world, from the smallest of the plant world, and how we live together. That is the true wealth that we must understand in our presence today. We must cease from using single-use plastics, and at the very least, engage in reuse of those resources around us, and at the very least, begin to recycle goods which we are forced to purchase. And even in portions of my home country of the United States, this is all but a foreign idea to reuse those types of things. Worldwide, we encourage the concept of free, prior, and informed consent before industries are allowed to extract resources from our territories. Now, we must also take it a step further. We must also teach the world to accept dissent. And we must teach the world the ability to hear the word no. For we understand that indigenous cultures from all over the world control the majority of our biodiversity. And at this moment in time, what we are witnessing is that the world is not able to take no for an answer, as we are now seeing it becoming criminalized just to show dissent of these types of industries, just to say no. Indigenous leaders from across the world are being thrown in prison, are being assassinated, are risking their lives simply for saying we want clean water to drink. Any type of understanding of degrowth, any type of understanding of our children having a future for generations to come has to start from these perspectives and our understanding of the world. Today, it is crucial, if not vital, for the survival of future generations, for us to stop being a part of this world that is being developed, that is consuming all that is there. As I was mentioning, I've already seen the effects of climate change. Indigenous peoples have seen that all over the planet. And even we are already seeing the first loss of life due to those climate changes, even though hardly anyone rarely talks about that. Today, all that this world offers us, we must live in reverence and respect for. We must hear the voices of our indigenous peoples in any hopes of ending the suffering that is now being inflicted, that will soon come to greater amounts of the community of the world because of what we see happening with our earth. My hope and prayer is that our understanding of degrowth, our understanding of a world that lives in harmony, will be brought in through voices such as that are here, that we can come together and understand a place where we all have a role in living a healthy life for all of creation. Mado Jagejisjay, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Thank you for that presentation that really brings the heart of the depth of the spiritual underpinnings of all of life, this respect for creation and a kind of anti-pollutant approach that says the consequences of overconsumption must be challenged. And I'm sure we're going to have more discussions about how our world as we live in today is sending signals that we don't know how to hear. No, I'm sure we're going to ask you to tell us some more about this matter of the criminalization of dissent and how this fight must indeed continue. We thank you very much. And we turn now to a presentation by Dr. Arnie Saiki from the US as well. And he's from Hawaii. He brings the Pacific and economic perspective. He's the author of the book Ecological Economic Accounts and coordinator of Imipono projects. We are very pleased to have Dr. Saiki and welcome now to speak to us.
Thank you for having me. Aloha kako. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion on post-growth. In these 10 minutes, I hope to leave you with some tangible optimism by introducing you to intermediate accounting from a Pacific perspective. So restoring our ecological biodiversity, reversing climate change, and redistributing global wealth are the three biggest issues challenging ecological and economic justice. Intermediate accounting is a post-growth initiative that could provide the systemic sea change necessary to address this crisis in global governance. It is apparent that we are on the brink of global catastrophe and that the structures and choices expressed in our present economic system valorizes rather than punishes ecocide, wealth and health disparities, and perpetuates the kind of exclusionary practices that invokes this doomsday outlook. It is also apparent that the crises that we are faced with is an existential conundrum. Peace achieved through war is a moral hypocrisy. How can we take pledges of good climate policy seriously if our leaders continue to provoke military incursions with the most reckless abandon? Demilitarization, deoccupation, and decolonization, we cannot address post-growth if we continue to reproduce these very conditions that enable hegemony. So having gotten that out of the way, I will demonstrate in the outline that intermediate accounting is an achievable post-growth campaign addressing the issues of environmental sustainability, well-being, and global governance. If our objective is to reduce fragility factors, we must focus on growing factors that promote economic and ecological justice like restoration, revitalization, and redistribution. Therefore, we must begin with another kind of accounting methodology that redefines and re-quantifies growth using indicators that developing countries and impacted peoples require. Intermediate Earth is our campaign to transition our national, regional, and global accounting system. This was initially developed in collaboration with the Pacific Conference of Churches and the Pacific Theological College, which last year culminated in the publication of a book called Ecological Economic Accounts Towards Intermediate Values. While I initially conceived of this as something that could be promoted through the ACP countries, it really was geared towards a program for Pacific regionalism to address factors that kept the Pacific tethered to the colonial, post-colonial neoliberal system. Then in 2020, when the COVID pandemic happened, it didn't take long to realize that this had the potential for being more than a Pacific or an ACP construct. The world demanded change. Our little accounting paradigm could really be an explosive, radical seed for global ecological and economic transformation. While there are many alternative indicators being discussed right now and new ways for accounting for GDP, what makes the intermediate accounting equation unique is that it does not simply adjust national accounts by adding new environmental indicators. If all we are doing is adding new green or blue indicators, we will not be addressing the issue of redistributing wealth or moving away from the privatization or neoliberal framework. In fact, I would argue that some new indicators could simply impose another top-down consent for an eco-neoliberal economy, where the same power structures will be providing security, technology, monitoring, auditing, etc., perpetuating the current system of exploitation and exclusion that we need to be moving away from. Intermediate accounting is completely different. Firstly, we've created a more just way of measuring baselines. Secondly, we include a factor that allows for a relatively seamless transition away from the dominant GDP-based national accounting system towards one where well-being indicators can modify our national accounts. And thirdly, we are inclusive of real-world market strategies that can make this financially viable for developing countries and underserved communities. Typically, economic baselines are the starting point or the base from which to measure growth. Baselines are all used to measure gains and losses. All indicators that measure growth use baselines as a starting point. The unique thing that the intermediate baseline does is that it inverts the starting point to be the goal and captures the incremental data against the time axis towards restoration.
Yes.
In the movie, in the Pixar movie Soul that came out last year, The main character, after he transitions, has to wait in that long line to get into heaven, and then realizes that to get in, he has to reunite with his soul to repair his merit. We are in that kind of logic. We need to reunite with our baselines and engage in an economy of reparation. This inversion is the kind of systemic reparation that we need to break out of the cyclical terror of history. It is a better reflection for measuring environmental and social indicators as it values people's interactions rather than treating everything as a commodity. This inversion is represented in our equation with N representing the factor that is being restored. You can apply this to almost any environmental condition and record quantifiable data to meet the real world conditions for auditors and regulators. And while I know this sounds like a very bold assertion, I would put it to the test in real world terms. To make a claim that there is a tangible equation that can be used to restore our ecological biodiversity, reverse climate change, and redistribute global wealth sounds like hyperbole or snake oil or some magic fountain of youth, but it is not. This is simply a mathematical formula that can be tested through input-output tables, measuring our interactions over time, calculating the rate by which restoration and rehabilitation can occur in quantifiable and relatively predictable terms. So rather than a top-down commodity-driven approach where environmental values are leveraged against carbon offsets, for example, the intermerit baseline is a bottom-up approach where environmental values are determined by the interactions of local communities. What could be better than local, indigenous, or customary processes developing and benefiting from their own services and technologies to meet their targets and goals on their timeline? Imagine that by inverting the baseline, there could be a verifiable way to quantify our ecological interactions and essentially own our data, protecting the inherent wealth of environmental health and well-being factors. We have mapped out a curriculum that outlines the micro and macro coordination needed to implement and grow this framework. But what we lack is the kind of on-the-ground institutional support that our interfaith councils offer and the ability to communicate this story to their communities. Organizationally, we have developed some tools like the intermerit characters, the manifesto, and the curriculum, but we simply need more engagement with institutional governance. So when we consider the accounting standards checklist for ESG, or environmental and social governance, we're talking about a reporting format focusing on corporate governance around non-financial measurements for environmental sustainability and social impacts. ESG has not yet been standardized or quantified, which I would say is one of the objective goals in the current international climate and SDG meetings. And so the question remains, how do we quantify what is inherently unquantifiable? Methods and standards need to be worked out, and the only solution that seems to be on the table is the worst one of all: the privatization and valuation of our resources based on commodity scarcity. So very briefly, I just want to say that Wall Street has recently created a commodity investment sector on water trades based on California water prices. It's these kinds of utilities that appear to check off the environmental sustainability box in ESG reporting, but it does so at the expense of people and the rights to access. So I cannot help but wonder if much of the military base building near aquifers or the licenses given to industries that contaminate our groundwater inflates the commodity scarcity pricing of water. And if it does, what does that do to how we access water? So as a bulwark to this kind of degradation and depletion, we could treat the intermerit equation as a financial index, like a stock index, but rather than it being managed by Wall Street, an intermerit index can be managed by the very same communities that are doing the work. This is particularly relevant as the IUCN recognizes the central and essential role of indigenous communities in stewardship and conservation of biodiversity. There is a high potential for creating new financial markets based on the measurement of our interactions rather than on the valuation of commodities, shifting the demand for extraction towards one that values service. This data belongs to indigenous and customary rights holders and stakeholders, not Wall Street fund managers. This kind of data access could provide the triple benefits of sustainable livelihoods, decentralized local ownerships, and democratic participation. We aim to enable these kinds of conditions. We all have the opportunity to measure, to count, to examine, to protect, to nurture, to analyze, to collect, to describe, to compile, to publish, to monitor and manage our environments. This is a service that is certainly much older than capitalist and privatization regimes, and our local economies should benefit from these interactions. What the intermittent baseline does is serve as a kind of verifiable guideline for regulators and auditors to mark the rate of restoration, to see whether communities are indeed attaining the goals they have set for themselves. So in light of the promise of optimism that I mentioned in my introduction, I would like to respond to the ask and call to action that is inscribed in the timeline and end with a request. If intermittent accounting complements and catalyzes other initiatives to produce the post-growth and post-colonial futures that we want and deserve, then can we raise this math over the specter of our current global governance? Thank you very much for your time. Sorry, I went over a lot of time, but thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. That is more than a mouthful, but there seems to be really much to chew on, because to my mind, you're helping us to drill down the issue, since we know that what matters to us, we count. And I hear you speaking to us and showing us how using from rather than a top-down approach, but from the bottom-up approach, a more aspirational and indeed very inspirational approach to how we might set goals for where we want to go and sense the timeline and measure and report on them. I am sure there are going to be many questions and a very rich conversation around this very, very interesting proposal, the intermittent accounting approach for global economics. Thank you so very, very much, Dr. Arne. We return now and welcome Dr. Fundiswa Kobo. She comes to us from South Africa and brings a global South feminist and theological perspective to our discussion. She's senior lecturer in Christian spirituality, church history, and missiology at the University of South Africa. Warmest welcome to you, Dr. Kobo.
Thank you so much, and greetings, and a special word of thanks to the organizers of the NIFEA initiative for this opportunity to speak at this e-conference as a womanist who is Black and African. Sisters and brothers. This theme evokes the insights of the statement entitled "The Cry for Life, Spirituality of the World," and thus frames my reflections. Cry, cry, cry for life, for the peasants who produce our food but go to bed with empty stomach, for workers who keep the wheel turning but carry heavy burdens on their backs. Cry, cry, cry for life, for the courage, for the hope, for the forest, for the stream. Bodies may die, spirit never dies. In our struggle, we burst in songs. As a new day dawns, we will shout in joy. This statement, drafted by the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians in their third General Assembly held in 1992 in Nairobi, Kenya, which offers critique of Eurocentric frameworks, is still poignant in the analysis of a fragmented creation and lived experiences of women and the oppressed in the global South, in countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and various parts of the world. It traces oppression and fragments in creation from the transatlantic slavery in the 16th century, an epoch of enslavement of knowledge, bodies, and spiritualities of Black humanity, and especially Black women. It is also poignant and inspires us in the analysis of the continuation of a cry for life for Black and African women and Black women all over the world, and thus the groans of broken Black bodies and creation that continue to this day in the quest for liberation of Black humanity, for wholeness and self-healing. 26 years later, since the drafting of the statement, Vuyani Velem observed that today in our world, the skies are throttled, mountains are crumbling, streams and the deeps that bowed in prayerful glory to God are left roaring, and their waves lifted on high in piercing groans. Creations is groaning, he argues. To pray and to pursue justice is heavy and deep. So his insights are helpful for us as we grapple with the cry for life, as they also point to the growing fascism of the West with COVID-19 pandemic that has aggravated this cry for life as it exposed the continued inequalities and contradictions. The statement further exposes oppressive systems where many are victims of a world power system that uses people for labor, yet those people struggle to make ends meet. Their cry for life is raised from the midst of misery and from within situations in which the forces of death are rampant. It is a cry for material conditions and speaks to structures that keep them at the same trenches of destitution up to this day. These pathologies affect Black women more because they are already at the bottom of the hierarchy in racist, sexist, and capitalistic societies. Gayatri Spivak asserts that clearly, if you are poor, Black, and female, you get it in three ways. A fragmented creation inspires an African womanist who has been dislocated and whose body has been dungeoned in dealing with her disposition to return to her African heritage, which offers her alternatives to decenter Western forms of life, knowledge, and spirituality. African people are brought into and immediately given a unified cosmos in which life, faith, knowledge, and unity are gifts. To Orobaita, Africans are profoundly concerned with harmony, cosmic harmony between and among humans, animals, vegetation, and all elements of nature. The fundamental principle for Africans is that you respect things you cannot create. The ethic thus entails maintaining and sustaining rather than scattering. The values of African people are directed at respecting or maintaining things as they are at the cosmological level. And this is why African people find it so difficult to separate their spirituality from everyday living. In the African cosmos, the relationship between men, women, members of the LGBTQI+ community, animals, and ecology is a given, the gift of an integrated, interconnected space for life. One becomes awakened into an order that is unified and integrated, and therefore relationships that integrate rather than disintegrate are at the core of African spirituality, ethics, ecology, and life as a whole. If we are to define Black African spirituality, ethics, and ecology in terms of interconnectedness, and if the core of spirituality, ethics, and ecology among Black Africans is indeed a unitive approach to life, a constant seeking to bring pieces together, however lost they may be. If that is the struggle, then the disintegration of a woman as a result of patriarchal violence is inconceivable, especially when this struggle for the integration is interpreted by exponents of liberation such as Boesak, Velem, Musala, and others in the South African context. From the perspective of a womanist, the apparent emphasis on one of the constructs of colonization, such as racism, without similarly emphasizing the plight of women, which was synchronized with all the levels of colonialism, is a critical question that a Black theology of liberation must deal with, because true liberation would not undermine this core value system, and therefore the spirit that must be imbued and expressed in human relations. It must be deemed unacceptable to disintegrate other constructs of oppression in the quest for the liberation of humanity. To do such is unimaginable and anti-African. We must examine the internal intrusions into this value system before even turning our attention to the external intrusions. Equally, the disintegration of creation is inconceivable if we take John Beatty seriously when he argues, wherever the African is, there is his religion. He carries it to the fields where he is sowing seeds or harvesting a new crop. He takes it with him to the beer party or to attend a funeral ceremony. And if he is educated, he takes his religion with him to the examination room at school or in the university. If he is a politician, he takes it to the House of Parliament. In terms of this cosmology, evil is that which destroys the unity of this gifted universe and world and disrupts the harmony of life, breaking up the relationship between human beings, creation, and animals. If anything becomes the first point of evil from an African perspective, it is the spirit that disintegrates. In relation to worship, if we must identify that which is anti-worship, it would be that which undermines this reverence for the unity of the created order and epistemologies that cause a scattering rather than a drawing together. That indeed has been the constant existential concern for a Black woman or womanist who's African in relation to the inherently Eurocentric spiritualities that are proposed. Since Eurocentric spiritualities and the spirit of empire are so pervasively individualistic, they are synonymous with scattering and conquering, and any assumption of spirituality by a womanist that does not reject such an approach as life-killing will never promote the development of African spirituality. For a womanist, resistance against the disintegration of life has been an ongoing discourse from the Dungeons of El Mina. The El Mina castle was the site of the transatlantic slave trade and remains one of the best symbols of the ruthlessness of the colonial matrix of power. The songs that have come from the dungeons, the darkness, the stench of El Mina since 1492, the dance and the rhythm of life since then, all has been a constant resistance against a spirit that is invading, disintegrating, and conquering. And even as we experience growing fascism of empire, even during the COVID-19 pandemic, it is that spirit that we continue to resist. In conclusion, from a womanist perspective, the fragmenting of this harmony by empire manifesting in various constructs of oppression that converge on Black bodies is a disturbance. Moreover, patriarchal violence and the fragmenting of a Black woman within the context of the African heritage is problematic. The liberation of her body is thus a liberation of her heritage and spirituality for the liberation of Black humanity as a whole, which can only happen by decentering from the West. The resistance of the young people and their anger women and their struggles against patriarchy, including all these currents that inspire a new vision of living, express hope that denies death and affirms life. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kovo, for that African woman, the womanist presentation, and given to us with such passion. I hear the resistance to that spirit of disintegration, for you call us to recognize that at the heart of human life is this spirituality, a spirituality which is in keeping with harmonious relationships between people and people's environment. Thank you so very much. We look forward to engaging you in those liberating issues and thoughts as you have shared them with us. We want to turn to the last speaker for the morning, and don't be anxious that we may be a little bit out of the anticipated schedule. This is so rich and welcoming. Let us receive from Reverend Rosemarine van Eindet. She's in the Netherlands and an activist, pastor in the Netherlands, and the co-initiator and spokesperson for Climate Wake, or in an attempt in Dutch, Die Climate Wakker. And we are so happy to have her. Let's hear her perspective.
Thank you so much, and I love that pronunciation. So I want to take you a bit on my journey in climate activism. I don't have all the answers, but I think I've learned some lessons in the past half year where I've done a lot of different things. And I want to share with you 6 lessons I've learned. I hope I have to go through a presentation, I think. Yes, these are the 6 lessons. And we will start with the first, face the fear. I think we don't actually really, well, look the beast in the mouth, we say in Dutch. And I think that's such an important first step when you want to do activism, to really find out what is at stake, and at this moment, what is offending the earth, what is offending God at this moment. And I have 2 images for you to contemplate that. This is the first one. I think what is so deeply sad is that this is not comical at all. It is not an exaggeration at all. I think the thing that is missing on this page is a lot of people where the rich people are handed life vests and the others are not. And some people from the Pacific are already drowning. I think that would complete this picture, but let us look at it for a couple of seconds and really try to let it sink in what is happening at this moment in the world. And then we will go to the next figure. You might know it. Oh, I think for a lot of people, the screens, the pictures are in front of it from the participants, and you have to move it to the left because the most important part is on the right of this figure. This is the temperature of the Earth throughout all week and the history we know. And this really shows what is at stake. And I think that line on the right that goes straight up is terrifying. And we are on the top of that line, and it's still not going down. And the longer we go up, the longer, it might mean that we will never be able to go down anymore. This is not something that we really feel, that we can't grasp this, the enormity of this. But I think it is important that we are brave enough to face this, because that helps us to go forward. I think the first reaction a lot of us have is that we freeze, is that we think, well, this is too much, and that you don't know what to do then. And it is important that we don't stick to the freezing, but that we take that feeling of and turn it into action. And I think it's important not to skip that feeling of because that can really be a motor for you after that. So now I want to some ideas for how you can turn to action. I think the first thing that is important is to suit the situation, to find out what is needed here. And what I noticed in the Netherlands is that a lot of people are not aware of the enormity of the crisis, the catastrophe that is coming, and also not aware of our role in it. At this moment in the Netherlands, there is a very long formation going on, and we decided to hold a vigil or awake the whole time that the formation is going on. So day and night, there is like a chain vigil. So like 2 people are waking, and then they, after a couple of hours, they give it over to someone else. And we do that at a political place in The Hague. We are very visible, so we are always there. We are not losing sight of what is at stake at this moment, what the politicians are going to decide. We are saying we are not backing away. We look what you are doing because this is so important. During the day we are at the place, and during the night we do it from our home. So at 2 to 4, there's also someone who is literally waking up and holding awake for the climate. And the people at the location also make flags, and they put text on it or pictures. I included pictures here because Dutch would be hard for you. And we have like hundreds of these flags. And what we did with that is that we went to the politician and we asked them to choose one of the flags that really helped them to see how grave the situation is, and that helped them to make good policies. I think the one on the left is very funny. It's the person wrote on it, "Okay, boomer, you broke the biosphere, you fix it." So like one of the vigilants wrote that down, and one of the politicians chose that flag, and it's hopefully in his office now. And when the people from the parliament were looking at all these flags, they said, wow, you really feel the gravity of the situations, the urgency to act now. And I think it is very important when you choose to act in a certain way that it is fitting to the situation. So that this is such a scary situation, and that we stay and we look at it and we stay there is a very powerful message, I think. Another lesson I learned is to really look at what is needed. And I think what I said before is an example of that. But another example is what I noticed was that when I shared things on activism on my Facebook page, that a lot of people who were liking it, also if it is more civil disobedience, a lot of the Dutch ministers were liking it. So like the clergy. And that was curious to me because I didn't hear a lot from the clergy about the climate. So we tried to talk to them, and we heard that a lot of people were like, yeah, but the national church is not saying anything about this. So it is really hard to take a stand. So at this moment, we have written a letter and asked people to sign it, and a lot of the clergy is signing it, in which we ask our national church, the PKN, to speak out to the government and say that we as the Netherlands should do everything within our power to stay below 1.5 degree warming, which we are certainly not doing at this moment in the Netherlands. And I think that's really important to see, like, this is lacking. The church is not doing this yet, but should do that, and then try to change that. And I hope we will, but I can't tell you right now because the letter hasn't been sent yet. The next lesson I learned was to ask people to join you, that there are a lot of people who are also really concerned with what's going on. So when we started the Waken, we asked a lot of quite big groups to join, and they were all very eager to. like a lot of political groups, but also churches or other religious groups, and farmer organizations. So I think that really helps because it makes it so much stronger, and you get a lot of new input. And I think also the church should find allies in unexpected places. I think another thing that is asked and that we as Christians do not always feel comfortable with is that maybe action is asked of us that is not comfortable, that is weird. So this is a demonstration where we just lie for dead on the street for some time to ask for attention for the climate crisis. This is another way that I demonstrate. But it's important to note here that as a Dutch citizen, as a white Dutch citizen, I have a lot of privilege so that I can participate in civil disobedience. I can rely on the police not doing anything weird. So, for example, on my back, I have the sign "Netherlands, pay off your climate debt," which is a quote by climate activist Elvin from Kenya. And I texted with him beforehand, and he said, "Whoa, you are blocking a street? You shouldn't do that in Kenya. The police will break your neck." And that helped me realize that I have this privilege, that I can demonstrate that we have that right here, and that I can rely on good treatment, but that I then also should do it, that it is important to use that privilege. This is another way we demonstrate it. I have a job as a minister in prison, and the pension fund, my pension fund, gives a lot of money, like billions, literally, to the fossil industry. And that's really weird. It's really weird that I, as a minister, am giving via my pension fund a lot of money to the fossil industry. So some time ago, we occupied the lobby of that pension fund, and I am holding a sign that says, "While I preach in prison, my pension fund is financing crimes, violent crimes against creation." And I found it very important to do this in minister clothing, because that really, this is what it takes. To find an action that really speaks out. Like when you write a letter, it's really abstract, but to embody the action you are doing is, I think, very important. And for example, this action, I wasn't alone there. There were a lot of other people who were also occupying this place. But this got a lot of media attention, and also it gives a kind of emotional disruption for people to see this. And also to see a picture like this. And this is the media attention that we get from that. The sixth lesson that I learned is go too far. I think we are always afraid that we would go too far, but I think at this moment the question is more, we should be afraid not to go far enough. Because that is really what's at stake here. When you see where we're at in the world, when we look back in 50 years, what do we want our legacy to be? When we have warmed 3 degrees in 50 years, which is likely to happen if nothing changes, if we can turn back and we have ruined the earth, what want we to, so this is a very difficult sentence. What do we want to have done at this moment? How can we look back then and think, okay, I have done what I could? And I think for a lot of people, for a lot of churches, more is needed at this moment. I think, and I don't mean that all people should do civil disobedience, because that's not an option for everyone, and it's also very heavy sometimes. But I think this is the time to be very, very, very bold and not hold back in any way. This is the last example. I participated in the blocking of a road that leads to Shell. And you can think, well, isn't that you are disrupting a lot of the people who are working? But at the same time, how can we keep on letting this system ruin the earth? you don't stand up and try and do something. And it might not be perfect, but it is then something. I think that is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Rosemarine, for that northern perspective of an approach to activism. I'm hearing you not just saying to us, but showing by your demonstrated action that even civil disobedience going as far as is necessary to face the fear and to seek for the kinds of allies that could help to move the world together in the right direction. Thank you very much for those experiential learning that you have given us the access to by sharing with us so deeply this morning. Thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, want to really thank you again for having joined us. We are so pleased that you are with us and that you have been sharing in this. This is the opportunity now for this to be as interactive as possible. While we only have a relatively short period for direct questions to any of our speakers or general questions that you would like speakers to respond to, please take this opportunity now before we break into smaller groups for workshops. And perhaps I'll begin by one of the questions that I saw in the chat and invite others to be prepared to be unmuted so that you can share your questions before us. But perhaps to Dr. Prulia, what could be the role of global tax justice in all of this? Perhaps as you respond to this, others will ask other questions and we will give all panelists opportunities to be involved.
I think that's a great question. I mean, I spoke a bit in my talk about the importance of the redistribution of resources being like the part of like the degrowth agenda. And I think this comes down to kind of, you know, appropriate tax on wealth and the difficult process in which that is politically achieved and national state in all countries. So tax justice means a tax on wealth for me. And I think it also means the flip side of that is to have like, you know, a living wage, to have a global minimum wage, to have like some kind of global public kind of as you have in India, where you have like some kind of income threshold when people are not working, as we've seen with the COVID crisis. But I also think that, you know, like some of the kind of thinking right now around kind of what's happened and what's been exposed in COVID is that there's a real massive missing amount of global public investment, which tax should be providing. So if we got an appropriate level of tax from the gain from corporate activities, then we would have enough money for global investment and we would be able to tackle the kind of glaring inequalities in health and education. So how do you get like a movement that kind of raises awareness of global public investment? And there is an ongoing consultation at the moment globally around global public investment as a movement itself that's really important. And I think as part of that, like what is the role of multinationals? What are the kind of, you know, different ways in which a global approach to kind of wealth taxes corporately at the global level can be agreed on? We've seen like the difficulties in that in the US itself, in kind of, you know, all the political dynamics and all the things that make like the journey towards wealth taxes really complicated and something that there is a massive political lobby against as well. So it is really an important part of, you know, kind of structural inequalities today, I think, from my perspective.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I see and recognize the hand of Victor Morales, and we welcome him. You could just unmute and ask your question to any of our panelists or all.
Thank you very much for sharing your views. I was wondering, when it comes to the concept of degrowth, Dr. Luca mentioned the Green Deal, and also I just understood that you were a bit skeptical as to how realistic the goals are when it comes to growth, and if we understand growth as a good life. So how can we really understand those goals? Is it really just idealizations, or is it really something that is worth fighting for? How can we, or should we rethink them and be more realistic as to what we want to achieve? That's my question to you and to everyone else.
Thank you.
Yeah, I actually think that I should bring in Arnie here, because I think I just want to say to all of the panelists, all of you were incredible. Like, I've learned so much about kind of what degrowth means in practical context across the world. And this has been a really enriching space. But Arnie, I think that you tackled metrics and kind of how we can use metrics in a really innovative way. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on what's just been asked.
Indeed.
I do. I mean, what I do think one of the problems, I mean, at least right now I'm living in Los Angeles, but I do think one of the problems with the Green New Deal and many of the way that we've been approaching, the SDGs, especially from following the UN through the UN Statistical Division, is that there are like a lot of backdoors for privatization. And I have a big problem with that, because I do think that that the strategies for degrowth really must include and it should not be an eco-neoliberal approach to trying to solve this climate crisis, because the redistribution of wealth, I think, is really should be one of the objectives for this campaign.
Thank you. I believe that Dr. Rogate Mshana wants to ask a question. It would be great if he will unmute and ask it himself, but I will pose it for him. It's going to go to Reverend Rosemarine. Is he going to ask the question himself? It would be great.
Yes, my question was whether the style, the movement, the activism, the way you do the work there in Netherlands is quite interesting. It's true that in Africa you cannot afford to do that. We are going to be killed the next day. So what I'm asking you, you are privileged actually to go that way. I was asking, to what extent then are the parliamentarians now in your country pick up your ideas and then act on them, even influencing the whole European Union about these issues?
Thank you.
Yes, very good question. This is a twofold answer. What I showed with the Klimaatwaken, the flags that we handed over, I think that helps to get more urgency ideas, and I don't think you can measure how they are influenced by that, but I think it shifts them a little bit more in the right direction, but it does not change everything completely. With regards to civil disobedience, which is something else that I also do, I am involved with Extinction Rebellion, and I'm also one of the people who talks with parliamentarians, and we hear from them that the actions of Extinction Rebellion really help set the agenda, that they shift what is normal. Like with Extinction Rebellion, we say the Netherlands has to be climate neutral in 2025. Well, we are talking about 2050. Or a lot of other organizations are saying 2030, and we are saying no, but when we look what is at stake, we cannot do anything else than get climate neutral before then. We are being reckless with our future. And I think you're really influencing the dialogue, and people will not take our perspective, but they will change theirs a little bit to ours. What you're doing with civil disobedience, and I think you can also do that in other ways that are not disobedience, which won't get you arrested, is that you ring the alarm. And I think in some way there's needed something else than regular demonstrations, and that like more of an emotional disruption is possible everywhere, I think. just when like, for example, the strike that Greta Thunberg was doing is not illegal, but it is emotional disruption that someone quits school every week to strike. So I think that direction would be really helpful.
Thank you very much. I wonder if Ndizwa would want to make any comment from an African woman's perspective, a kind of reflection on how Rosemarine's approach in activism is in the global north. We seem perhaps to have lost her. The time is short for these open questions, so let me just read one that I think has been sent through the chat earlier. It seems that a legal invalidation of the doctrine of discovery is key to global indigenous peoples' sovereignty and healing. What hope do we have in this respect when the US has little respect for the UN Convention? And perhaps our collaborators in the US would want to respond to this, and others might respond as well.
As Chebon?
Yes, Nair Chebon, yes, please.
Yes. I did not want to speak before anyone else. I can say just a little bit. You know, when we think of the concept of the doctrine of discovery, the majority of citizens of the United States have no idea that that is even the foundational piece that justified an understanding of exploitation of territories, exploitation of the land, and even it is the foundation of the legal precedent that established laws in the United States. They don't even know that existed, and that was a proclamation, a series of proclamations from, at that time, the established Christian church. One of the biggest difficulties from indigenous peoples in the United States is trying to make people aware and open the eyes of the devastating nature of the lifestyle of this country, of not even respecting a global discourse, a global conversation of what is being done to even enact change that will somewhat reflect some of the things I shared about an understanding of our place in all of creation. And to go back to the question that Gordon had even mentioned before about the criminalizing of dissent, is that I am always fulfilled when I hear conversations of the work that my relatives across the world are doing for this earth. When we look at here in the central portion of the United States, those representatives, we call them politicians, parliamentarians, those that are elected officials, they are actually sponsored by extractive industries. They are actually sponsored by oil and gas professionals and funded. And so therefore they introduce laws that say we can't even protest when it comes to civil disobedience. To give you an example, in our state of Oklahoma, they have now made it legal. So when things get so bad, we take to the streets. We take to these actions that go out to raise the awareness. They made a law that said it is now legal for persons, if we are obstructing a thoroughfare, a road or a highway, they made it legal for persons to drive through it despite injury or harm that they are doing. That is what we're seeing here in the United States for those voices that are providing dissent. So my hope is that with the continued pressure, with the collective voices, because it is a growing amount of persons who are raising awareness, demanding justice and equity, that they will start putting those pieces together. Even our own indigenous peoples often do not even realize the connection that it has. This country of the United States has with the doctrine of discovery and that mentality that the earth is here for our exploitation. So my hope is that we will continue to do that. As some of you may know, we do have a continued presence through my office and our indigenous peoples here with those conversations. Unfortunately, we are just a small percentage of the voices that exist in the US. And so we are doing everything within our power. But that's the kind of atmosphere that we are facing. And the example, I left this line out in my statement. I forgot. I think I just skipped over it. For those that truly want to understand the criminalizing of us as Indigenous people saying no, most of us have heard of the Standing Rock uprising, that you might look at that entire situation where the only thing that Indigenous peoples were armed with was prayers and ceremony and reflection. But how many instances of violence did paramilitary forces inflict upon people that were praying? Even myself, while I was there on site, we went into a sweat lodge ceremony, and while we were praying, military helicopters were continuing to harass those prayers during that moment. That's the type of harassment we see day in and day out. So just a little bit to answer the question. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you kindly. So there is clear activism at all levels and in various places all across the globe.